The Story of Havarian, Part the Third. Renar rides free. The story thus far. While visiting the estate of another Hanath noble, Lord Havarian falls foul of his host, Jovan, who plans to have him killed. Havarian is saved by the slave Renar, who defends him and puts himself in mortal peril by refusing his master's orders to kill him. Eventually, to save both Havarian and himself, Renar kills Jovan. Renar and Havarian ride further north to give the other slaves time and space to pass off Jovan's death as the result of an animal attack. Havarian becomes seriously ill, and it falls to Renar to get him back safely to the estate, despite the savage weather and the marauding wildlife. He hopes to plead with Havarian, to beg the Lord to buy him and to free him from the miserable existence he has known on Jovan's estates. Another errand delays his conversation with Havarian, and he returns to find Havarian and his entourage gone. The story continues. Havarian remembered nothing of the journey home, a journey of 3 days that normally would have taken 4 or 5 were it not for the insistence of his attendants that the horses be pushed to their limit. Havarian's own physician praised them for their haste, encouraged them to believe that they had contributed a large part in saving his life. He knew nothing, of course, of the role played by Renar, of feral wolves and the hand-built travois, and labouring to keep the semi-conscious man alive after he had been fool enough to get and stay wet. In fact, Havarian was almost 10 days gone from Jovan's estate before he opened his eyes and spoke for the first time. He turned his head to glance around his room, taking in the doctor, a nurse, Eli, and Cressa. What he said first was, "Where is Renar?" Eventually a decision had to be made. The choice was travel slowly by coach, where Havarian could again be heavily wrapped in furs to protect him from the cold, or wait at least 4 more days before his doctor would agree that he was well enough to ride there. By the time the coach, bearing both the doctor and an almost fully recovered Havarian, arrived at the estate, 23 days had elapsed. He reproached himself bitterly for abandoning Renar. He spoke quietly to his own gods, asking that he be given a chance to repay the slave for the sacrifices he had made to protect him. Havarian hoped fervently that the tale of a fatal targ attack, a story concocted by the other stable hands involved, had been accepted, and that when he asked for Renar, he would not be directed to the burning pits in the fields out beyond the stables. The estates were much changed. The gathering rooms no longer stank of incense and liquor, the deep red hangings had been replaced, and everything appeared lighter, less oppressive. Somehow there seemed to be more air in the halls, as Havarian waited for a chance to speak with the widow and her son. He bowed politely to the cold, haughty woman, who remembered him as one of her husband's guests. That, apparently, was no recommendation in her eyes. She treated him with frosty disdain as he expressed his sympathy for the loss of her husband, the father of her son. He was well aware that the last time he had seen her, he had stood almost shoulder to shoulder with her, while they watched her man savagely violate a servant and discard him in the straw of the stable like so much waste. No one was in any way deceived about the nature of the man they were lamenting. When finally he came to ask about the slave Renar, the widow's whole face twisted in disgust. She listened as he talked about his plans of travelling north, how he was in need of a guide, and how Jovan himself had suggested that he might wish to buy the stable boy. She turned to her major domo, raised her eyebrows a little. "If my lord Havarian wishes to purchase—" She did not name Renar. It was almost as though she feared his name would contaminate her mouth. "Show him the goods in the stable yard." Then a flick of her eyes told them that they were dismissed. They were shocked when Renar was finally brought before them. He was shackled behind at the elbows, so that when he was pushed to his knees, he fell forwards and hit his face on the cobbles. Judging by the bruises, not for the first time. Havarian came closer, as Renar struggled to get back to his knees, but a fit of coughing took his balance away from him again. Eventually the major domo gripped him by the neck of his tunic and hauled him upwards. The slave's skin was grey, sweaty and pallid, his eyes unnaturally bright, feverish. Havarian tried repeatedly to get the other man to look at him. At last he put a gentle hand on each shoulder, put his face close to Renar and said, "Renar, it's Havarian. You remember me? Havarian." Renar looked up without any real interest, showed no sign that he recognized the man who was touching him. He dropped his gaze, then shook his head, his face filled with misery, as he looked away and said softly, "Gone." Havarian bowed his head a little, trying to make eye contact. Gently he said, "I don't understand." Renar turned his pale grey eyes fever bright onto his face. "Havarian is gone. He left." He hung his head again, a picture of despair. Havarian looked up at the major domo. "Why is he in chains?" He asked the question with some trepidation, terribly afraid of the answer, but he was surprised when the servant merely said, "He is a thief. My lady insists that when he is not working, he is shackled." Havarian looked at him quietly, horrified. What did he steal? Who did he steal from? The major domo said, "From you, my lord. I can return it to you now." He fished from his pocket what looked like a slim bracelet. Several hairs from the tail of a horse had been intricately woven with apparent effort and skill to make a wristband to hold a single amber bead. It was a small work of art. The old man continued, "He was foolish enough to wear it openly. Of course it was noticed. He swore he found it when he visited your rooms after you left. My lady took the view that he should have handed it to me at once. Keeping it was theft. So he was punished, and he wears the shackles to remind him to use his hands only when it serves the household." Punished. Probably beaten and starved. Because he held on to a single bead that Havarian's tailor had replaced without fuss on the same day that the jacket returned to his estate. He didn't hesitate. "Please tell your lady to name her price. I will pay whatever she thinks he is worth." The major domo was surprisingly helpful. The servants assembled a large wooden bath and filled it with warm water as he and Havarian stripped Renar's filthy clothes and readied him to soak in the soothing scented waters. Some of the kitchen staff came forward, volunteering to clean his clothes, as Eli and Cressa made certain that the guest rooms, their overnight accommodation, were prepared to their satisfaction. The doctor had travelled with them to take care of Havarian himself. If he was a little surprised at being asked to tend to a stable boy, he made no demur. By the time they had wrapped Renar in blankets, clean in a comfortable bed, his first treatment had begun to take effect, and for a moment he looked at Havarian with some recognition, smiled in disbelief, then said, "It's a good dream," as he closed his eyes and slept. Renar was still a little bewildered when they led him to the carriage 2 days later. Havarian had wanted to carry him, but the horseboy had shaken his head. He could walk. He would walk away from this place. He put a hesitant foot on the bottom stair of the carriage, Havarian ready to support him as he climbed in. Then he hesitated, stopped. He looked at Havarian, thinking something through. Then he turned away and walked towards the stables. The horses started screaming and kicking at their enclosures. One at a time he went to them, stroked their faces, purred and clicked his tongue at them. Havarian watched, wondering at first if the animals could possibly understand that Renar was saying goodbye. The biggest of them, a jet-black stallion, was clearly angry, pushed him away roughly each time he tried to say his farewells. Eventually, shaky and rather unsteady on his feet, Renar gave up and walked sadly back towards the carriage. The stallion screamed and kicked open the door of his stall, raced after Renar, and knocked him to the ground with a toss of his great head. Renar sat still, looked upwards at the enormous animal above him, as Havarian held his breath. Then he smiled and clicked his tongue. The horse put down his head, allowed Renar to sink his hands into the heavy fur in front of his ears, and pulled away and upwards, hauling Renar to his feet. He held the horse's head for a long time, stroking and whispering to him. Eventually the stallion jerked away and ran, easily jumping the fence into the next field. He carried on running, screaming loud enough that Havarian was sure he would hear that noise in his next nightmare. Renar, moving as though he were sleepwalking, climbed into the carriage and allowed the doctor and Havarian to cover him securely with heavy blankets. He was asleep before they left the stable yard, and slept heavily for the rest of the journey to his new home. While the two younger, less experienced hands in Havarian's stables quickly recognized him as highly capable, and soon began to look up to him and to turn to him for advice, Borazan, Havarian's major domo, was taking a little longer to get accustomed to the new man. His manners were terrible. He would look you in the eye at completely inappropriate moments, almost as though he were defying you to take issue with him, and at other times he would drop his gaze and all but ignore anything said to him. He obeyed Havarian most of the time, but his response to instructions from Borazan or any of the other senior staff seemed entirely to depend upon his mood. He obeyed if he felt like it, made up his own mind each time about whether or not to simply carry on with what he was already doing. Today he was insisting on talking to Havarian personally, and stationed himself outside the gathering room where the master was entertaining some of the local lords. He sat with his legs crossed, his back to the wall, closed his eyes and waited. Borazan considered him mightily overindulged. From the day he had arrived, when he was carefully tended by the doctor, Havarian himself, and his close attendants, Eli and Cressa. To be fair, the boy had been terribly ill, feverish and weak, but the indulgences had not ended when he recovered his health. Had he been one of Havarian's regular bedmates, he might have understood it a little better, though the idea of the master condescending to a stable hand was thoroughly unpleasant. His trews and tunic were newly made, and Borazan knew that he had parted with his old clothes, only when Havarian threatened to have them burned. Even so, he kept them in a small trunk in his room in the stable block. The shoes were replaced only after some negotiation. He was allowed to show the cobbler how they were made, and still he grumbled softly for a month about how uncomfortable the new shoes were. All this special tolerance made Borazan's skin itch, but more than anything else, it was the fact that alone of all the servants, Renar was allowed to carry a weapon. A knife, a huge dog claw, wickedly sharp, with an intricately carved wooden handle that he had made himself. The boy had some skill, there was no denying it. And then there was the horsehair bracelet he wore, delicately, expertly woven, including, if Borazan was not mistaken, a single amber bead from one of the master's best jerkins. If Renar had spent even one night in Havarian's bed, Borazan would know. There are few secrets among the slaves, but it was not hard to understand why the other servants suspected him of earning his favour on his knees, and gossiped about it whenever there was no one there to silence them. Then there were the kitchen girls. In the first month, Borazan knew that Renar had turned away advances from any number of them, kindly but firmly. They would gather each morning in the recess of the back kitchen window to watch him strip off and stand under the water faucet that he had set up in the front wall of the stable. Some of them left their beds early so as not to miss the spectacle. Eventually one of them faced up to Borazan, the chief cook, an older woman who sometimes shared his own bed, and asked him outright if he was there for the master's pleasure. Was he forbidden to touch anyone else? If so, she would tell the girls to leave him alone. Borazan didn't know. He felt that he should know, but how to ask such a question? Next morning, attending Havarian's breakfast, he said, "The new man is very popular with the kitchen staff. They're competing to be the first to bed him. I understand several of them have made the offer, but he has turned them all down. Of course." He fell silent as Havarian raised his eyes from his plate and looked at him. "Why, of course?" Borazan hesitated. It's difficult to imagine he would show such restraint unless he were forbidden. Havarian tried not to laugh at him. It was a tricky question. As major domo, he needed to know if Renar were off limits, but how to ask without insulting his master. "He's free to do what he likes. I'll tell him so today." And he had. They were riding together, something Renar had insisted upon. If they were to travel long distances, Havarian's riding skills would need to improve a good deal. Havarian, who had been complimented many times on his skill on horseback, found the direct criticism both surprising and refreshing, and he allowed Renar to adjust his seating, the way he held the reins, most of what he had learned from childhood. Right now he was grumbling about Havarian's fine boots, which were too stiff and prevented him from feeling the horse's breath. He was saying, "I'll talk to the shoemaker," when he looked up to see Havarian smiling down at him. "I hear you're popular with the kitchen girls." Renar actually blushed, said softly, "I haven't touched any of them." Havarian damned his own clumsiness. Of course he would be quick to deny it, to protect the girls, never mind himself. He smiled at Renar. "This is not Jovan's estate. I don't care who you bed. Enjoy yourself a little. Of course, do your best not to populate the place with grey-eyed children." Renar's face went white at that. Havarian had no way to know that Jovan had warned him more than once that were any child to appear with Renar's light grey eyes, he would personally cut its throat. So his reaction was perhaps not as cheerful as Havarian had hoped for. Instead, he merely nodded and went on with his critique of everything Havarian thought he knew about riding. And then he began to take up the girls on their offers. They would draw lots, and the winner would take him something tasty, something small but special from the kitchen. They would arrive at his room after dark with the treat and a winning smile. Renar's room was a converted horse stall, but the bed was at least a bed. The horses, curious, would occasionally lean across the dividing walls to take a look at what was going on, but soon became accustomed to the procession of girls who took themselves across the stable-yard from the kitchen under cover of darkness. The first girl took his virginity and spent some time explaining what to do, how to make it pleasant for both of them, as well as how to prevent making babies. She was kind enough to keep his innocence to herself. He was a quick learner, and the girls, he never turned one away, gave him plenty of practice. The only one he came close to refusing was Fala, the sweet but rather slow and cripplingly shy girl who collected the dirty clothes for washing. Whether through malice or kindness, The others had bullied her, persuaded her to go to his room late at night and offer herself. She had gone most unwillingly and was very afraid, tearfully so. One of the women walked across with her and left her there, giving Renar a knowing smile as she drifted away. Renar was the only man she had seen naked, and that only because the other girls had pushed her to the window one morning to watch him shower. That was bad enough. Being alone with him in his room after dark was quite another matter. She trembled and was very afraid she might pee herself. He looked at her, reading the situation for a few moments, before he finally reached out and pulled on his tunic. Then he climbed out of the bed and approached her. "Come and meet my friends." He put a gentle arm around her, walked her from stall to stall, even allowed her to stroke the mares. The stallions were too much of a risk. She was small, and one good bite might deprive her of a hand. They shared the sweet biscuits she had brought, then kept their clothes on when they shared the bed, and Renar held her close. Just before he fell asleep, she asked shyly for a kiss. He smiled a little, nodded, and gently obliged. The kitchen staff gaped the next morning when she walked proudly out of the stables, having spent the entire night there. The less kind ones had taken bets that she would run from him in the middle of the night. Instead, she did her best to smile haughtily and told them nothing. Her silence, of course, could not last. Borazan heard later that Renar had taken pity on her, taken her to his bed, without forcing himself on her, held her through the night to keep warm. Like many men, Borazan had a soft spot for the broken and injured, and he became a little more tolerant of Renar after that. When a few days later he saw that Fala was bruised and trembling as she went about her duties, it took him only a few minutes to find out who had hurt her. One of the bakers, a pastry chef, who had bullied any number of the girls into having sex with him. Those with any sense avoided him and did their best not to be left alone with him. She surprised him by telling him that she had already seen a physician, that Renar had taken her there. They had been kind, given her something for the pain, something to soothe her nerves. She was fine, she told Borazan, and reluctantly he let her go about her work. Then he headed for the kitchen. He could hear screaming as he drew close. When he entered, he saw the pastry chef on his back on the floor. Renar was sitting astride him, a hand round his throat, his targ claw knife in his other hand. He was carving the chef's face. As he stood, he said softly, "Next time I will take your eye." The bruised and battered man struggled to his feet, a hand to his bloodied cheek. "I belong to my lord Havarian. I render him a service. You cannot maim me, you fucking savage." Renar spat. "You can make cakes with one eye." Borazan did not trouble Havarian with the issue. He listened to the cook's denials and dismissed them as lies. He warned Renar that he was not to take such action in future, that he was to come to the major domo with any complaints. His tone told anyone watching that he was merely paying perfunctory lip service to the rules, that he, at least in part, approved of what the man had done. To the cook he said, "If I hear another such complaint about you, I will let him take your eye. I will ask him to do it. Are we clear?" Ignoring the man's yell of protest, he pointed to the complex mark on the cook's face. "Is that, what, like a letter?" Renar grunted. It means rapist." Borazan nodded. That seemed entirely reasonable. Watching him now, sitting cross-legged as though in meditation, his sleeveless tunic showing the tattoo of intertwining thorns that formed an armband above his right elbow, Borazan shook his head. Any other servant he would have driven away with strict words. With Renar he held his tongue, rather than risk being mutely disobeyed. The doors opened when servants arrived with trays of refreshments, and Renar was on his feet. He hovered as Borazan slipped through to let Havarian know that his latest pet was awaiting his pleasure. The master smiled a little, aware of just how much of a challenge the new man was proving to be for the tried and trusted Borazan, and nodded his permission to let him in. When the major domo turned, he was surprised to see that Renar had already come into the room and was standing behind him as he asked the question. He sidestepped Borazan and approached Havarian closely, spoke to him as though there were no others in the room. "My lord, I have something to show you." Havarian's eyebrows raised. Calling him my lord showed real effort on Renar's part. Havarian nodded, appreciating the fact that he was being careful not to disrespect him in front of strangers. The effect was marred slightly when he took Havarian's hand without permission, bringing the palm upwards so that he could pour into it the contents of a small pouch. Havarian looked at the grain in his hand. Some of it was moving. "What?" "Horse feed." Havarian fought his disgust as he said softly, "Something is moving in there." Renar huffed a breath, saying, "Maggots," as though that were obvious. He used a finger to flick away a couple of the largest ones. A pair of interested onlookers hissed in disgust and leaned away from this small diversion. Havarian looked down as some of the maggots hit the floor. In his gathering room, Borazan would be outraged. Renar went on, "Not the maggots. They can eat maggots." He lifted Havarian's hand a little and said, "Smell it." Havarian gave him a warning look. Renar squeezed his hand into immobility to prevent him getting too close to the mix. "Don't breathe it in." His audience exchanged glances. He was blithely giving instructions to his master. Renar held up a finger, a signal that Havarian already knew meant caution, take care, and watched as he sniffed gently at the feed in his hand and began to frown. "Mold," said Renar. "It's all like that." Havarian made eye contact with him, waited. "I need your permission." "You want to change providers?" "Of course." Renar nodded, gratified, glad he was not expected to spell out word for word what he needed. He wanted more. "You must talk to your farmers. Ask them to grow the crops we need. This is adequate, but your horses will not thrive on it." By Renar's standards, that was practically a speech. Havarian nodded. "You have my authority in this." Renar gave a small, tight smile, nodded his thanks as Havarian looked at Borazan and used his eyes to direct the majordomo's gaze to the mess on the floor. Renar started brushing the grain off his hand into the feed sack, and a servant appeared at once with a damp cloth for Havarian to clean his hands. He had still more to say. "I have to hunt. They need fresh meat." His small audience was beginning to smile. His rudeness was a thing to marvel at. No honorifics, no please or thank you. It was easy to see that he spent more time with horses than with people. Since he had arrived there, Renar had made no attempt to leave the estate and its surrounding fields. He had focused on proving his worth, showing his gratitude by doing everything he could to improve the condition of his master's horses. He made changes to the water supply, to the internal organization of the stables, spent time teaching what he knew to the two lesser hands, setting up a roster each day to make sure that the animals were exercised. He had made great progress there, possibly less in his ability to behave as polite society would expect of him. He looked Havarian in the eye, wordlessly expressing his request to be trusted, to be allowed to leave. Havarian smiled, nodded. Of course, do what you think is best. As he was walking away, one of the guests blocked his path, laughed aloud when Renar tried simply to walk around him, and shifted himself to bring the younger man to a halt. When Renar looked up at him in some surprise, he smirked and said, "Renar, it's Renar, isn't it? Joven's pet." Renar looked him in the eye, expressionless. The man came closer as though wishing to share some gossip. Renar held his ground, but his face was pale. "I remember you when you were a boy, before you learned to speak Hanath. Wild little bastard. Beautiful, gods you were beautiful, but feral." He raised his voice a little, aware that those around him were listening, willing to provide them with some entertainment, a good tale. "Jovan couldn't make you obey him. Beatings, the most savage beatings, threats, nothing worked. Until he sent you to town with one of his servants. His major domo, I think. I heard you spent the day in a brothel, just watching. And then he gave you the choice. Obey him, or he would sell you to them." Renar's face was white. He blinked and said nothing. Not a difficult choice, I'm sure, when it came down to it. Cooperate with one man when the mood takes him, or spend what's left of your life strapped down for an endless line of hard-handed strangers whose faces you would never see. He smiled at Renar's motionless face. "Still, it must have burned. You had so much pride, even as a boy. Your father was an elder of the tribe, wasn't he? In your eyes, that makes you almost a young noble, I'm sure. You must have asked yourself what your father would have thought of your decision." He smirked, enjoying what he imagined was going on behind that impassive mask. "Jovan was besotted with you. He would damage anyone else who dared to put a hand on you. But he treated you like trash. I once saw him push you against the wall of the well and ream you like he was ploughing a field, in full view of his guests." The Lord looked down at him. "You look well, clean, well-fed. I wonder if your new master is a little more generous with your services." He stroked a finger down Renar's cheek and brushed his thumb across his lower lip. Then Havarian was there, putting a hand on Renar's shoulder. "I believe you have work to do." Renar nodded mutely and fled. Borazan stood to one side, perturbed by this display of casual cruelty, and distressed to learn at least some of what the young horseboy had endured at his previous estate. He listened as Havarian, conversational, told his guests how Renar had risked his own life to save him, when he foolishly rode his horse into a swamp that sucked both of them down so fast that he was sure he was going to die. How he had scrambled, soaked and frozen, over the prone servant, and how Renar had gone on to save even the horse, at terrible hazard to himself. Then there was the time he stupidly allowed his clothes to get soaked when they were travelling, how he developed a fever, and again Renar kept him alive, dragging him on a handmade travois for hours, fighting off wolves when they were attracted by the scent. For some reason at one point there was a dead wolf lying alongside me on the travois. At least I think so. That might have been a fever dream. I owe him more than one debt of honour. He's here to guide me when I travel north, to help me prepare. In the meantime he works with the horses. He's not here as a plaything. He made eye contact with the man who had touched Renar, who nodded, grudgingly accepting the refusal. Havarian made eye contact with Borazan. Not a plaything. His guests knew now. He must take the time to make sure that Renar also knew. He frowned to himself. Surely Renar was aware by now that Havarian would protect him. Had he made it clear enough to the man? He hoped so. Renar walked straight to the stables, saddled the biggest horse, an angry stallion that the others hesitated to work with, and broke one of his own rules. When he left the estate, he left alone. The sun had set and the gates were barred for the night when Borazan informed Havarian that Renar was gone and had not returned. They exchanged looks. Both had worried that something might happen as a result of the tasteless advances made by one of the guests, that Renar might react by doing something rash. Havarian ate with his visitors, agreed to Borazan's proposal that they begin a search at first light. It seemed clear to him that one of two things had taken place. Either some accident had befallen him, and he was lying hurt, perhaps dead, somewhere in the woods beyond the gates. Or he had listened to those repulsive comments and had decided it was time to make his escape. Sleep evaded him that night. He had brought the young tribesman home because of what he owed him. Certainly he had made waves in the placid equilibrium of the household. He did not know how to behave because Jovan had taken care never to teach him. He was rude when he had no intention to offend, and Havarian was never sure that he would obey any given instruction. But he was brave, good-hearted and honest, loyal to a fault. Havarian knew he would die to protect him. They had become friends. He hated the idea that he had been slow to intervene when Renar was being publicly shamed, and he might have lost him for good. Sadly, Havarian reached a decision. If Renar was hurt, they would retrieve him, rescue him. If he had simply run, they would let him go. He, Havarian, would let him go. Renar would ride free. He deserved that. He had earned it, many times over. Havarian was in bed, not asleep, when he heard the banging on the main gates and went out on the balcony to watch as Renar returned, dragging the carcass of the largest targ he had ever seen. There was the reason for the delay. It must have been slow work hauling an animal that size over rough terrain. He watched for a while as the other stable hands lit torches that chased away the night in the stable yard, while his horse danced and roared with excitement. Renar began at once carving the skin and flesh of his kill. The other horses, smelling the meat, began kicking the walls of the stables. Finally, a little angry, Havarian flicked a summoning hand at Renar. "Come here, I want to talk to you." Renar looked up at him and shook his head. He bowed to the work again, and Havarian could see that he was talking rapidly to the two boys, who nodded and ran across to look up at Havarian and those of his guests who had come to see what all the noise was about. It would be unfair to reproach Havarian for being dissatisfied at this point. He had worried that Renar was hurt, or dead, or had chosen to escape to leave him. He had worried and mourned, and even persuaded himself to accept his loss. And now here he was, waking the household with this din, and refusing a direct order where others could see, could witness his blithe disobedience. Borazan, whose immaculate dress hinted that he had not slept either, was clearly in a mood to disapprove such behaviour. When the two boys approached and looked upwards, he barked, "What is it? What is so important that he disobeys a direct order from my Lord Havarian?" The younger of the two boys, the brighter one, said, "My Lord Havarian, Renar thinks you might not comprehend what is happening, and asked me to explain for him. He is ridden back from the hunt with the body of this fine targ, and the horse has not yet been allowed to feed. If he walks away, the stallion will rip into it, and the skin, which he wishes to prepare as a gift for you, will be ruined. He asks you to forgive his rudeness." Borazan snorted. He was fairly sure that the boy had invented that part. He asks that you understand and forgive him." That, at least, had more of a ring of truth. Havarian was aware that Borazan and 3 or 4 other nobles in various states of undress were watching, waiting to see how he would react. He couldn't help it. He smiled. He waited for a moment until he saw Renar's head come up, long enough to make questioning eye contact with him, as close as he might ever come to asking for permission. Havarian reflected for a moment. He might have bought a slave, paid for one, but the creature he brought home was something quite different. He nodded his approval. Then Renar smiled broadly, nodded his head in thanks, and bent back to his task. Havarian laughed softly and went back to bed. There was targ meat at breakfast. The head of the kitchen had been roused by the commotion and claimed the best parts of the animal to be soaked and marinated overnight. The smell was enough to make anyone hungry. Some pieces were salted and stored, while those of less quality were fed directly to the horses that night, or hung in the cold room to be preserved for future feeds. The targ pelt was stretched out on the wall of the stable, a magnificent example of its kind. The glossy black fur was thick and long, luxurious. It would take many days to finish preparing it. In the meantime, the stable hands had cleaned the yard of the guts and blood, and all 3 had stripped off to use the makeshift shower that Renar had constructed. The meal was almost over when Borazan came to say that Renar asked permission to speak with him. Havarian thought about refusing, still a little irritated that he could be so easily tormented by his servant's unexplained absence. Then he nodded his head and gave tacit approval. He was fairly sure that Renar had not slept, but he looked well and strong as he approached. Without speaking, he sank to one knee and raised his palms to present a gift. It was a dagger, made from a targ claw, the biggest that Havarian had ever seen. The handle was even more beautiful than Renar's own, and Havarian knew from their conversations together that it had cost Renar many a day's work to perfect it. He picked it up, hefted it. Well-balanced, comfortable to the hand, and wickedly, wickedly sharp. He smiled down at Renar and nodded. It was a fine gift. The claw itself had arrived last night, but the handle, Renar must have worked on that almost from the day he arrived. He could see a perfectly executed glyph in the design that Renar had shown him before, a sign that said "Have" in the written language of Renar's tribe. Renar looked up at him with such a soft, clear gaze that he understood at once what he was trying to say. He held up the knife to the light, admiring it again. "My friend," he said, looking into Renar's trusting face, "you are most welcome."